In this lesson, we're going to learn how to solve quadratic equations by using the quadratic formula. We know there are several methods that can be used to solve quadratic equations. They include factoring, completing the square, the quadratic formula, and graphing and estimating the zeros. Today we're going to focus specifically on the quadratic formula. So what exactly is the quadratic formula and how does it work? Well, suppose we have a quadratic equation written in standard form. If we were to take that equation and apply the process of completing the square and then solving for x, we would end up with this formula. X equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. This formula can actually find the solutions of a quadratic equation. In fact, the huge advantage of this formula is you can solve any quadratic equation by using it. Whether it can be factored or not factored, whether the solutions are rational or irrational, you can always use the quadratic formula. So why bother with the other methods? Well, there is one disadvantage. The quadratic formula is very tedious to use. It's time-consuming, and there's a lot of places where you can make errors, but it's very versatile and very handy. Let's begin today by looking at some examples. In our first examples today, let's take a look at a couple of equations that actually could be solved by factoring, but instead of factoring, let's use the quadratic formula. The first thing we have to remember is that the quadratic equation must equal 0. So in order to solve 4x squared minus 6x minus 10 equals 8, we have to begin by subtracting 8 from both sides so that we have the equation in standard form and equal to 0. Once we've done that, we have to identify the values that are going to go into the formula. We have to identify the a, b, and c. A is the number in front of the x squared. In this case, that number is 4. So here, a equals 4. B is the number in front of the x. We have minus 6x, so b is negative 6. C is the constant at the end. Here we have minus 18, so c equals negative 18. Once you've identified the values for a, b, and c, then you're ready to apply the formula. The first thing we always do is write the formula down. X equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. And now we do the substitutions. X equals negative b. b is negative 6, so x equals negative 6. Plus or minus the square root of b squared, b is negative 6, so negative 6 squared, minus 4 times a, which is 4, times c, which is negative 18, all divided by 2 times a, so 2 times 4. Now we have to go through a step at a time and clean this up. Let's start with the first piece, negative 6. Negative 6 is simply 6. Then we have plus or minus the square root. So we write plus or minus the square root. Now look inside of that radicand. We have negative 6 squared minus 4 times negative 18. My recommendation is to simply type that into the graphing calculator. Be sure to use parentheses, otherwise you might end up with a problem. That equals 324. So we have inside our square root 324. Now that's all over 2 times 4, and 2 times 4 is 8. Now we have to clean this up a little bit more. 324, it turns out, is a perfect square. 324 is 18. So we have x equals 6 plus or minus 18 divided by 8. Remember, these are two possible solutions. X equals 6 plus 18 divided by 8, which is 3, and x equals 6 minus 18, all divided by 8, which is negative 1.5. We just found the solutions to that quadratic equation by using the quadratic formula. Very versatile, it always works. This is an equation that actually could have been factored, but you can always use the quadratic formula if you choose. Here's an example for you to try. We want to solve the equation 2x squared plus 7x minus 44 equals 5. Remember, the equation must equal 0. Please make this equation equal 0 and then identify the values for a, b, and c. Once you've identified the values, come back to check before continuing with the formula. Please pause the video here. The first step is to subtract 5 from each side of the equation. The equation in standard form is 2x squared plus 7x minus 49 equals 0. Now we need to identify the values for a, b, and c. A is 2, the number in front of x squared. B is positive 7, the number in front of x. C is negative 49 because we have minus 49 at the end. Now let's write down the formula. X equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. Now please make the substitution of the numbers into the formula and then come back to compare your answer. Let's see what the equation looks like when we substitute the values for a, b, and c. We have x equals negative b, so x equals negative 7, plus or minus the square root of b squared, 7 squared, minus 4 times a times c, that's 4 times 2 times negative 49, all over 2 times a, so 2 times 2. Now go through and see if you can simplify this expression to find the solutions to the equation. Please pause the video here. We clean things up one bit at a time. We have x equals negative 7, so x equals negative 7, plus or minus the square root, so we write plus or minus the square root. And now we have to take the radicand, the stuff on the inside of the square root, and we can type that directly into our graphing calculator. Be sure to use parentheses. We find that that's 441. So the square root inside is 441. All over 2 times 2, which is 4. So x equals negative 7 plus or minus the square root of 441 divided by 4. It turns out that 441 is a perfect square. When I type square root of 441 in the calculator, I see that that's 21. So x equals negative 7 plus or minus 21 divided by 4. Remember, that gives us two possible solutions. X equals negative 7 plus 21 divided by 4, which is negative 3.5, and x equals negative 7 minus 21, all divided by 4, which is negative 7. So the solutions to the equation are negative 3.5 and negative 7. Now let's take a look at a couple of examples where the solutions will be irrational. In other words, the equation cannot be factored, and we will have square roots in our final answer. 5x squared minus 2x minus 15 equals negative 5. The same process and the same rules apply. The equation must equal 0 and be written in standard form. So we add 5 to both sides so that we have 5x squared minus 2x minus 10 equals 0. Next, we have to identify the a, b, and c values. In this case, a equals 5, b equals negative 2, and c equals negative 10. Once we've done that, we're ready to use the formula. We always begin by writing the formula. X equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. And then we do the substitution. We substitute the values in. So negative b, opposite of b, negative, negative 2, plus or minus the square root of b squared, negative 2 squared, minus 4 times a times c, minus 4 times 5 times negative 10, all over 2 times a, 2 times 5. Now we simplify one part at a time. X equals negative negative 2, which is 2, plus or minus the square root of the stuff on the inside. and we type that without the square root directly into our calculator. 204. So 2 plus or minus the square root of 204, all divided by 2 times 5, which is 10. Now we're ready to move on. We check the square root of 204 in the calculator, and we see that it comes out to be a decimal. It's not a perfect square. So we can simplify the square root of 204 by applying the process for simplifying radicals. 204 is 4 times 51, which is 2 square roots of 51. X equals 2 plus or minus 2 square roots of 51 all over 10. Now we have to do some final simplifying. Notice in the numerator we have 2 plus or minus 2 square roots of 51. We have a common factor of 2, which we can factor out. 2 times 1 plus or minus 1 square root of 51. That's divided by 10. And now we can reduce the 2 and the 10. The 2 and the 10 reduce to 1 and 5. So we have 1 plus or minus the square root of 51 all over 5. You can leave your solution like that, or you can break it down into the two separate solutions. Either approach is fine. If you don't feel comfortable with what those numbers are equivalent to, you can always type them into your calculator to see the decimal approximations. The solutions are approximately 1.628 and approximately negative 1.228. The final exercise today is for you to try. Here's a quadratic equation that will have irrational solutions. There will be square roots in your final answers. Remember that the equation must equal 0. Please make the equation equal to 0, identify the a, b, and c values, and then come back to compare. We begin by adding 7 to both sides. The equation in standard form and equal to 0 is 4x squared plus 8x minus 14 equals 0. In this equation, a equals 4, b equals 8, and c equals negative 14. We're now ready to apply the formula. X equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. Go ahead and substitute the values into the formula and then come back to compare. We substitute the values in. X equals negative b. b is 8, so x equals negative 8. Plus or minus the square root of b squared, which is 8 squared, minus 4 times a times c, minus 4 times negative 14, all divided by 2 times a, which is 2 times 4. Now go ahead and simplify this expression and see if you can come up with the solutions to the equations. Please pause the video here. When we simplify, we have x equals negative 8 plus or minus the square root of 288, all divided by 8. We check in our graphing calculator to see if 288 is a perfect square, but it's not, so we have to use the process of simplifying radicals. The largest perfect square that goes into 288 is 144 2 times, so we can rewrite the square root of 288 as 12 square roots of 2. X equals negative 8 plus or minus 12 square roots of 2, all divided by 8. Now we factor out the common factor from the numerator, 4, times negative 2 plus or minus 3 square roots of 2, all divided by 8. We can reduce the 4 and the 8 to 1 and 2. Therefore, we have x equals negative 2 plus or minus 3 square roots of 2 all over 2. And these are the solutions to the equation. You could write the solutions as two separate statements if you preferred, and you could even check in your graphing calculator to see the decimal approximations. And that's everything you need to know about solving quadratic equations using the quadratic formula. As you can see, the process is a bit tedious. It takes some practice and some great attention to detail. I always consider the quadratic formula to be the method of last resort. I prefer to factor or complete the square when possible, but when all else fails, you can always use the quadratic formula and it will never let you down. Remember, you can learn more about the quadratic formula, including step-by-step directions, in Mr. Dorey's Algebra Handbook, available at www.doreypublications.com.